Hi everyone, my name is Maria, and I'm going to talk about bilingualism in early childhood. Now, I'm Russian, and up to the age of 4, I spoke only one language. I spoke Russian. And then, when I was 4 years old, I was kind of immersed in an English-speaking environment, and I learned English. And I've basically been bilingual ever since. Right now, I've got 2 kids of my own, and I'm raising them to be bilingual too. I also teach English as a foreign language, and for the last 5 years, I've been working with kids who are very young, like 3 to 6 years old, and I get asked a lot of questions about second language acquisition in early childhood and about bilingualism, and so I decided to start a series of videos where I will talk about that and answer all these different questions that come up with bilingualism. This first video is generally an introduction to bilingualism, how it works, and some of the strategies that I know that I've seen different parents use to create a bilingual environment at home. I also like to share my experience from my childhood, from my parenting now with my young children, and hopefully this can benefit you if you've decided to raise your children bilingual. Now, there are different reasons why parents would want to raise their children bilingual. Sometimes it's because the family is living abroad in a country that's not their native country, and they would like their children to speak both the local language and their native language. In other situations, maybe the parents are from different countries and have different native languages, and they'd like their child to know both of those languages. There is also what is known as non-native bilingual parenting, and that's when 2 parents would like their children to learn a language that isn't native to either of them, if that makes any sense. This is more prevalent, I think, with non-English speaking parents who try to teach their children English because of kind of the importance that the English language plays in the world today, and most communications, international communications, are done in English. So oftentimes parents who are not native speakers of English themselves would like to teach their children English from a young age, even though neither of them are a native speaker of English. This does happen with other languages too, not only English, but it just seems to me that English is the most common one, and that's the one I kind of get asked about the most. Now, over the years, I found that there are different definitions for bilingualism. Different people have different ways in which they would define bilingual. Some being more strict and some less strict with how fluent a person needs to be in both languages to be considered bilingual. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll just basically talk about it like this. There is balanced bilingualism, and that is where child or an adult knows 2 languages, well, exactly the same. Basically, they are a native speaker of 2 languages. That's what we call balanced bilingualism. And then there is imbalanced bilingualism. And honestly, that's the most common kind of bilingualism. And that is where a child speaks one language better than another. They are generally fluent in both languages. They understand them, they're able to communicate, but one language is more native to them, it's more natural, and in a situation where they can choose which language to speak, they will choose their majority language, even though they may speak their minority language very well too. There is also the case where a child grows up in a monolingual family and at some point begins to learn a foreign language. Maybe they take classes 2 or 3 times a week, they learn some words, they learn some grammar, and they get better and better with time. But usually this isn't referred to as bilingualism. This is just basic foreign language study. And the level of fluency in this case is usually lower than in the case of bilingualism, where a child is actually surrounded by 2 or more languages throughout most of their childhood. Now, I know that this subject is very debatable and there are lots of opinions out there, but this is just kind of one way to classify it so that we don't get confused in all these terms. Over the years, I've worked with and known many bilingual families, And there are different strategies that different families use to maintain a bilingual environment and make sure that their children get enough exposure to both languages. And I'm going to talk about some of the strategies that I know that I've seen so you can be aware of them and think and decide which strategy will work best for you. The first strategy, and probably the most common, is one parent, one language. And that basically means that each parent speaks a different language to the child. Sometimes there could be more than one language involved. There could be grandparents or nannies or aunts or uncles speaking other languages. And there have been lots of situations and stories, and it's been featured on TV and stuff where children can learn up to like 5 or 6 or even 7 languages just from interacting with different people in those different languages. Now, this is really phenomenal and exciting, and it has worked in many, many families, especially in families where each of the parents has a different native language. Maybe they're from different countries. But it's not always practical, because either way, the parents do need to have a common language that they talk to each other in. And oftentimes, that language basically becomes the majority language for the child, and there isn't enough exposure to the minority language. Another problem with this is that if one parent spends a lot of time away from home at work, and the other parent spends a lot of time with the child, obviously the child will learn the language of the parent who he spends a lot of time with than the language of the parent who isn't around them all the time. Again, because of exposure, because of the amount of time they spend hearing this language, interacting in this language. So if you do decide to try this strategy, you need to be sure that you kind of balance out the amount of time each parent is going to spend interacting in that language with the child. And if you feel that there might not be enough exposure to one language, then you need to think of how to solve that. Either maybe one of the options is to get a nanny or a babysitter who speaks that language and will spend more time with the child speaking that language, or maybe a grandparent, or maybe enroll them in classes or some other way to make sure that they get enough exposure to that language. The second strategy is one language, one environment. And I've seen this strategy work best when a family was living abroad in a different country. And then they would basically speak their native language at home, and outside of the house, the child would maybe attend school or play with the other kids in the neighborhood in the local language. And that way they would pick up their native language from their parents at home, and the other language from, well, the rest of society around them, from school, from their friends, from their teachers, something like that. This is great. Again, you need to be very careful and make sure that you get enough exposure to both languages. Depending on the situation, sometimes you could get a lot of exposure to the native language and with hardly any exposure to your native language at home, or sometimes vice versa. Especially if the child is very young, they may get a lot of their native language at home and very little exposure to the local language. So again, be sure to balance this. There are different ways of doing this. One is by enrolling your child in school or kindergarten or daycare or something, or other extracurricular classes, making friends with local people, inviting them over for parties, basically making sure that your child does get enough exposure to both languages. And the third strategy that I know, and this is the one that I use, is basically dividing the time. Dividing the time that you speak each language. In my case, I speak both English and Russian to my children. They know that I speak both languages. They hear me speak both languages to different people. And it would be strange if I refused to speak either one of the languages to them. So what I've done is I basically break up the day into sections, maybe like morning in English, afternoon in Russian, or the other way around. Now that they're older, it can be sometimes 2 hours in English, 2 hours in Russian. It depends. But basically dividing the time in the day, and spending a certain amount of time speaking one language and a certain amount of time speaking the other. This strategy works best if one parent spends a lot of time with the children and the other parent doesn't, because then the kids get enough of both languages just from one parent. This also works really well if one parent speaks both languages quite well and can speak both languages to the child fluently and correctly and stuff like that. So basically, those are the 3 strategies that I know of for creating a bilingual environment at home. If you know of any others, then definitely let me know in the comments. I'd be really interested to read about that because this subject is very, very interesting for me. Well, now that I've shared what I know about the different types of bilingual environments, I would like to talk about some sort of key ingredients that are very important for sort of creating that bilingual environment at home. Some things for you to keep in mind and be aware of. And the first thing I want to talk about is something I already mentioned, and that is exposure. How much time your child is exposed to each language. Because if one language will be majority, one will be minority, most likely. But how well that your children know the minority language depends on how much they're exposed to it. So you need to be very careful when planning your time and make sure that you create enough opportunities for your child to interact in both languages. And this doesn't just mean passive exposure to the language. It doesn't mean just hearing adults talk. It means being actively involved. It means maybe reading books and answering questions, asking your child questions, asking them to do something, or it has to be active interaction. Because if they just passively hear language in the background, I mean, it's great. But again, they won't be bilingual. They won't have enough active practice of that language to actually be considered bilingual. Second point I want to bring up is the importance of consistency. If your child gets random little bits of exposure to different languages, while that's not a bad thing, that's not gonna actually help your child be bilingual and know the languages really well. In order to sort of be natural in speaking another language, in order for them to feel that language is native to them, they need consistent exposure to that language. It's better to spend like an hour a day interacting with that child in a language than like once in the summer and then not for the rest of the year. Consistency is very important in all aspects of parenting, and language acquisition is no exception. So yeah, I've seen a lot of parents start trying to create a bilingual atmosphere at home, but it was random and kind of sporadic, and their child didn't make so much progress in one of the languages, and they kind of felt that they failed. But the fact of the matter is they didn't fail at all. It's never too late to pick up. But if you do want both languages to sort of be on the same level for your child, you got to be very careful, again, to be consistent, to make sure they have consistent exposure to both languages throughout a long period of time, over a long period of time. Yeah. And the last thing I want to talk about is confidence. You as a parent really got to be confident in what you're doing with your child. This may seem obvious, but it seems that there's sort of a lot of hype around bilingualism, and despite the enormous amount of research and sort of scientific evidence there is about bilingualism not being bad for children's brains, that it doesn't hinder their development in any way, and to the contrary, the way bilinguals' brains work is really quite phenomenal. But despite all of this, there seems to be a lot of negativity around bilingualism in some places, in some circles. People seem to think that if you start teaching a language to a child from an early age, the child might get confused, they might have speech problems, speech delay, all kinds of these problems. And sometimes when you kind of start raising your child bilingually, you might hear a lot of negativity from, I don't know, your neighbors or people around. And at this point, you really have to be sure that what you're doing is right for you. If you find yourself easily buffeted by these negative comments that people make, and you're not sure, you find yourself questioning, oh, am I doing the right thing? Should I really be trying to raise my child bilingually? Should I, am I doing more harm than good? If you have thoughts and feelings like this, I really suggest you spend some more time researching and reading about bilingualism. Become familiar with the evidence and all the research that's been done, because that'll help you gain the confidence you need to be consistent and to do what you need to do. And the thing is that little children are very sensitive to their parents' emotional state. And if you're nervous and worried about whatever you're doing, you're unsure of yourself, your children, especially the younger they are, the more they can sort of feel that. They'll feel that a lot. And that could, in fact, affect their speech development. So it's not really the presence of another language in their life which is affecting their speech development, but it's the nervousness and kind of worry of the parents that's more likely to cause speech delay or other problems like that. For example, I never had a question about whether bilingualism was good or bad. I never ever linked any problems with speech development to the presence of another language in children's lives, because, well, one, I grew up bilingual. Two, I know tons and tons and tons of other bilinguals who have been bilingual from childhood. And I have a lot of friends who are bilingual. So for me, the question wasn't whether or not I should raise bilingual children. For me, the question was how to make it a reality in our lives. So if you're still kind of questioning whether or not it's a good idea, then definitely do your homework, research, get those facts, that scientific evidence that you can kind of base your decision on. Two, surround yourself with a community of other bilinguals, either parents who are raising their children bilingually or who are bilingual themselves. And then again, lots of those questions and worries will fall away, because you will see real life people. You will be surrounded by them. You will have friends who are bilingual, and you'll see that there's really nothing to be worried about. And yeah, you won't feel so odd doing it. Well, that's it for now. That was just a little introduction to my video series, a little overview of bilingualism, the different strategies that I know of, the importance of consistency, exposure, and confidence in your parenting. And yeah, if you're interested in kind of diving into the subject a little deeper, then you can watch my other videos where I talk about how to start. If you don't know how to do that, how to kind of introduce a new language to your young child at home, how to find good books in a foreign language, how to read stories to your children in a way that's interesting and fun, and also about the different maybe difficulties and obstacles that you might face as a bilingual parent and how to overcome them. So if you're interested in all of this stuff, definitely subscribe to my channel, watch my other videos, and yeah, comment, because if you have any experience, either you're bilingual or you are raising bilingual children, do leave a comment and tell me about what it's like for you, your experience. If you have any questions, be sure and ask, and I'll do my best to answer. Okay, goodbye, see you later.